For those of you who don't know Nicole, he's really, again, one of the very few senior experts, not only in the U.S. but in the world, on cultural diplomacy, and has really dedicated, I think, the vast majority of your life to this, and has really been pioneering, in particular with his current position at the University of Southern California, really the development of this field. Allow me to say a few words about Professor Cull. From 1997 until 2005, Professor Cull was based at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, where he held the chair of American Studies and served as director for the Center for American Studies. His research and teaching interests are broad and interdisciplinary, centering on developing academic discipline of public diplomacy, the role of culture, information, news, and propaganda, and foreign policy. He's also worked broadly on film, television, and radio history, and the role of mass media as a source for historical study. He initially earned his BA and PhD at the University of Leeds. From 92 to 97, he was the lecturer of American history at the University of Birmingham. He's currently the president of the International Association for Media and History, has worked closely with the British Council's Counterpoint think tank, a member of the Public Diplomacy Council, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. His current position, his day job, so to speak, despite his many other activities, he's the director of the master's degree program in public diplomacy at the University of Southern California. Please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Professor Nick Cull. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be at this conference and to meet so many of you from so many places around the world. It's a great testament to everything you've done here, Mark, that you can bring so many people together in this exciting forum. I'm sorry I could only stay for one day, but unfortunately, my supervisor and mentor at Leeds University died quite recently, and we're having a memorial conference to him, which is running tomorrow and Saturday, and I felt that in the circumstances I really needed to be at that. So I'll be here as long as I can, and then I'll whiz over to that. So please, I apologize for not being part of the entirety of the conference. Sorry. Are you coming back?
Maybe Yusuf, if you're here, if you could come up, would be great.
That's not the problem. I don't know what it is.
Let the experts take a look at it. Okay.
Okay. So an outline of what I'm going to say. I'm talking about the future of cultural diplomacy, and I'll begin just with a little introduction to talk about the utility of looking into a crystal ball and thinking about the future. For me, as somebody who's worked as a historian, I found that switching to talking about the future has actually been a really smart move, because nobody can tell me I'm wrong, whereas when I was a historian, people would tell me I was wrong all the time. So I'll talk about images of the future. I'll talk about my take on what cultural diplomacy is. I'll talk about what I see as the four core approaches to cultural diplomacy, and then I'll talk about the changes that I see coming to cultural diplomacy. First of all, the change of actors, the change in the bodies who are conducting cultural diplomacy, the changes that are happening within existing actors in cultural diplomacy, changes to the content of cultural diplomacy, and then I'll finish up by saying what I would like to see in the cultural diplomacy. And what I'm doing here is tracing forward the trajectories that are defining the field of cultural diplomacy as I see it emerging at the moment. So first of all, images of the future. I've just completed a study of images of the future, a history of science fiction film, and one thing I noticed doing that book was that nothing dates like an image of the future. This is an image of the year 1980 as imagined in the year 1930, when for them 1980 would be, we'd all have individual aeroplanes, and the world would be full of fantastic cities, but the government would tell us who we would marry, and we'd have numbers rather than names. So nothing dates like an image of the future, but images of the future shape what we are, what we want, and shape what we get. Think of the way in which the Star Trek communicator influenced the design of the cell phone. Images of the future also affect what we wish to avoid. Think of Orwell's 1984, which has become a touchstone of in the debate around development of communications. Though I don't remember from the version of 1984 I read at school, the guy wearing the leather suit in the far corner of this picture. It seems to be a much more exotic edition than we were allowed to read. So the future becomes a zone in which we don't actually encounter the future, but we can find out a lot about our own present, and I think it's a worthwhile subject to raise in this kind of environment. So what is cultural diplomacy? Well, if traditional diplomacy is conducting foreign policy through engagement with a foreign actor, and public diplomacy is foreign policy through engagement with a foreign public, then cultural diplomacy is doing the same thing, but through a specific set of tools, the tools of a cultural intervention. And an example of this would be the way in which the Byzantine Emperor Basil commissioned Cyril, seen here in this icon, to spread Orthodox Christianity through the Balkan Peninsula, and thereby established a cultural affinity with Byzantium and a sphere that has endured to this day and that still defines that part of the world and creates a whole set of relationships. But it was a way of allowing the empire of Byzantium to punch above its weight effectively for 500 years, but a cultural intervention through subsidizing Christian missionaries. But, as was made clear in our first presentation today, cultural diplomacy is not only about export. The four core approaches that I see in cultural diplomacy are as follows. The first and the oldest one is the idea of culture as a gift, sharing the best thing in your country and sending it overseas to increase the prestige of your country. Like, for example, when the British send Shakespeare overseas. But the second would be cultural information, sharing something of your country which may not be part of the existing knowledge of the audience to which you are showing that. Sharing an unknown dimension to correct an image. So, for example, sharing a new playwright rather than an old and classic author with a foreign audience. In Britain, it's meant sending overseas radical, minority, progressive writers to blow the cobwebs off Britain's image. The third core element would be cultural dialogue, cooperation in the cultural field for mutual knowledge. Now, this is an exciting development in cultural diplomacy because it's about mutual transformation. The third area would be cultural capacity building, working through your cultural diplomacy to change or develop the cultural capacity in the audience with which you wish to engage, teaching cultural skills to promote understanding. Now, that cultural skill could be your language, and to me that's where foreign language work fits within this schema. The examples I have on the board, if you could lower the lights a bit, it would be easier to see the images there. But they're from two recent British Council plays, which were presented in the United States, both of which had a slightly radical agenda, were prepared to talk about Britain's foreign policy mistakes. The first, Black Watch, talked about talked about Iraq, the Iraq War, and the experiences of Scottish soldiers in the Iraq War. The second was a long 8-hour series of plays about the historical development of Afghanistan called The Great Game. And these were designed not only to transmit cultural information, but also to inspire dialogue and become a place where people could talk and new kinds of understanding mutual understanding could emerge. Now to talk about the changes. In terms of actors, we're likely to see many more players taking to the field of cultural diplomacy, including non-state actors. So I'd argue you don't have to be a country to conduct cultural diplomacy. And you're even seeing corporations seeking to use the tools of culture to advance their own interests. So we're in a situation now where BMW can hire some of the best-known Hollywood filmmakers to make a series of short films which might feature a BMW car at some portions, but also a cultural intervention to try and associate their product with culture in a more developed way than just putting out a commercial. We're seeing more sub-state actors developing cultural diplomacy policies. You could look at what the Canadian province of Quebec is doing. You could look at what Catalonia is doing. You can look at what Scotland's doing, all speaking for themselves and using culture as part of their regional development strategies. You can see city diplomacy including a cultural dimension. And I think that cultural diplomacy and city diplomacy fit very well together indeed. But one thing that's maybe more surprising is the development of transnational regions, and to see some transnational regions using cultural diplomacy to advance their collective interest. Because cultural diplomacy has historically been so much about, oh, my country is better than your country, like a sort of a cultural Olympics. The idea that two neighbors, in this case, the region I want to talk about is Sweden and Denmark, and the portions of those countries abutting each other, the Malmö-Copenhagen region, the Øresund region, where they have joint cultural events, they have a joint film festival, and are using the overlap in their culture to bring people to their area. You're seeing supra-state actors getting together through cultural diplomacy. One of the most exciting developments in terms of European cultural diplomacy has been the emergence of the UNIC committees, United Nations Institutes of Culture. Whereas 10 years ago, one of the problems with European Union member cultural diplomacy was the rivalry between the Cervantes people and the Alliance Française and the Goethe Institute and the British Council in so many capitals around the world. They seem to be competing. Now they have a committee where they work together, where they share ideas, they work out a common program of events, and are working to promote those things that we share, that they share. And I think that's a tremendously exciting development, even if the acronym UNIC is rather unfortunate if you want to present potency. We're seeing more networks becoming actors in their own right, online communities forming and addressing the world through cultural products. And this is something that we'll only see more of in the future. And a ubiquity of soft power thinking. The point of Nye's soft power was to say that values, that culture are attractive. Therefore, people who wish to be thought attractive do so by articulating their culture. And that's happening at all levels, not just at the nation-state level, but with various players pushing forward cultural elements or contributing to cultural elements as part of their overall strategy. We are seeing changes within those actors. Resources are tight, and all players in cultural diplomacy seem fated to be increasingly obsessed with evaluation. And one of the problems with an obsession with evaluation is that cultural diplomacy is quite hard to measure and often is best observed over an extended period of time. One of the threats to cultural diplomacy is from bureaucrats who want something that can give them a return immediately. And I'm worried by the pressure to show immediate returns rather than waiting. I think cultural diplomacy is like forestry, hence the picture of the tree and the guy trying to measure the tree. You only see returns over a long period of time. If you try and measure and evaluate forestry by the same method you use to evaluate the dairy industry, that is daily output, it doesn't work, and your logic of investment is reduced. Cultural diplomats around the world seem to be increasingly doing more with less. They're all becoming one-man bands. That's likely to continue. Everybody is looking for partnerships. I was struck by a meeting I had last year with senior Chinese cultural diplomats who were asking me about the best way to partner with NGOs. And that was a surprise to me because it was exactly the conversation I'd had a week previously with British cultural diplomats. And I thought, well, how amazing that we're all on the same page at this particular juncture. I think that the role of the state is shifting from being the source of cultural diplomacy, from being the sole funder of cultural diplomacy projects, to being the facilitator. And here I like to point to that old story, the story of stone soup. And it's a story that not many Americans know, but many Europeans know because it's ubiquitous in European culture. The story is of a time of famine when a stranger comes to a town and he asks for food, but they say there's no food. And he says, well, I'll do something. I will make you soup using just stones. And he calls for a cauldron of water, sets up the cauldron, boiling in the city square, and places 3 stones in the water. And then he stares very intently into the water. And as he stares, he says, this stone soup is so much better if I have just a few herbs. And somebody brings a few herbs and sprinkles them in. He then says, it's even better if I have a few carrots. And somebody produces a few carrots, so they drop them in, and so on. Just by wishing for ingredients, people volunteer ingredients they didn't know they had, until he's been able to create a soup that can feed himself and the whole community out of elements that they either weren't prepared to share or didn't realize had a value to the collective whole. And that's how the state can operate, bringing together through a small initial investment, or even just the barefaced cheek of trying to organize something, bring together a cultural event or intervention. In terms of content, we have to be open to user-generated content. And increasingly, I think cultural diplomacy will become providing the platform and allowing others to put what they want to happen on that platform. And we're used to that from arts festivals and events like the Edinburgh Festival. But online, this becomes setting up a platform like, for example, Second Life, turning it loose and waiting to see what people do within that environment, and being open to the amazing things that can evolve within an interesting platform. So like, put out your iPhone and wait to see what apps other people come up with. Don't expect that you'll be controlling all the content, and rather make sure that the environment you create is open to multiple users contributing stuff that you don't expect. We have to expect that the culture we create or facilitate will be viewed over a network, rather than thinking in terms of single event and single one-time exposure of an audience. When we create, we have to assume that it will be passed along. And that's why we have to start thinking about memes. Now, all a meme is, I mean, it's this scary internet word, but all it means really is an idea or a little bundle of information which is passed along a network and which has a life of its own. It could be a statistic, it could be a joke, it could be a poem, but imagining our contributions as being something which we hope will develop a life of their own is a slightly different way of thinking about information than imagining it as a one-time moment to which the audience present at that particular moment will be exposed. Memes have this capacity for being self-propagating, like little creatures that reproduce, and spread. And we need to start thinking in that way. With the proliferation of participants, of voices on the global network, there are many, many different voices out there. That creates a challenge, but I think it also reinforces the speakers, the institutions that have an existing reputation. And so what I'm seeing is the emergence of what I call the information brands. Even though the old systems whereby you spoke and you had this dedicated audience who were tied to you, the way that a water system in a house is tied to the water tank. You turn on a tap and in terms of broadcasting, you'd turn on the tap and the BBC would come out of your tap. We don't get our international communication that way anymore. Now it's more like the market in bottled water, where you go to the shop, you can choose from a variety of brands, and you pick out one that you like. And so I'm imagining the BBC as being an equivalent to Perrier. One, you don't get it from the tap, you get it from the store. Information is becoming like that. We're choosing, and our cultural information, our cultural experiences come to us bundled. And working in partnership with established information brands is one way of helping our information go further. So when we're seeking out partnerships, names, the names of the great orchestras, the names of the theatre companies, these still have significance. But the most significant thing I see changing is the emergence of the new credibility. In the past, when you ask people around the world, who is credible to you as a voice, you got all sorts of answers. Sometimes it would be a religious person, sometimes it would be a political person or a journalist, but now when you ask that question, you get one answer. Everywhere in the world, people say one answer: someone like me. And the amazing thing about the internet is it's now possible to get all your information from someone like me, because in a network, information is passed not from the top, not from the government down to the people, but from person to person to person. So people aren't reading newspapers, but they're getting material tweeted to them, retweeted to them, passed along networks, referred by email syndication, and stories, pictures, cultural experiences come to us, passed along, endorsed by our peers. If you are a cultural communicator and you are not like the people you wish to communicate with, you have a problem. The United States government, if it wishes to communicate with the people of the Middle East, has a problem because it is not like the people of the Middle East, but the people who are communicating, who the United States government wishes to compete with, that is the violent extremists, are very like the people they wish to communicate with. They have this, in that they speak the same language, in that they share the same historical experiences of being persecuted by the people with whom the United States government has been, until so recently, allied. Therefore, as Ambassador Schneider was saying, you have to rethink your strategy and empower. Rather than speaking for yourself, you have to empower those who will be credible to your audience. And that is a different kind of cultural diplomacy. It's not about imposing your culture on somebody else. Rather, it's enabling their culture to develop in a way which advances your mutual interest. And difficult to do, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean it shouldn't be done and shouldn't be thought about. But so what I'm saying is this new credibility comes from affinity, and the consequences of that affinity principle are empowering others rather than speaking yourself on every single subject. What I'd like to see in cultural diplomacy is that state cultural diplomacy should evolve to being much more about facilitating the incoming of culture as the export of culture. So I'd like to see import cultural diplomacy rather than export. In the United States, there is a terrible lack of translations of novels from foreign languages. It's really hard. I live in Los Angeles, and it's really hard to see a foreign film. These are not regularly shown in the multiplexes. It's hard to get them on TV channels. This is a problem. We need more cultural diplomacy inbound rather than outbound. So I think the British Council's Visiting Arts Program, which is now, well, let me think, it came about in 1976, so you do the mathematics. It's been around for a long time, but that kind of project to bring artists into your country is what we need more of in the future. We have to see cultural diplomacy as an essential part of diplomacy, not just for the nation state, but for any international actor, and not just an optional add-on, not just something that you do when you have a budget surplus, because nobody's going to have a budget surplus for a long time to come. Curiosity about other cultures should be an essential part of global citizenship, and something which we seek to inculcate in our students. Now, this is not something that's news to you because you're right here at this conference, but I think that there are a lot of influences that are seeking to deaden the global curiosity of people. But the final thing I'd like to see is maybe the hardest when you come from a society that feels that it has all the answers, and that is a real openness to transformation of the self. It's been quite easy for cultural institutes to sell themselves to their own governments as agents of transforming others, of giving the benefits of their society to the lesser nations of the world. But we can't proceed like that. We have to accept that we don't have all the answers and to look for a cultural diplomacy that is about mutual knowledge, mutual understanding. But once we start talking about mutual understanding, that is necessarily an admission that we have a personal lack, that we are not perfection. And we accept this in a human relationship. You meet somebody, you begin talking to them, you assume that you will be, or that you will be transformed by that relationship. You don't think, well, I know everything, so I don't need to learn anything from this person or be transformed in any way by this encounter. But this is seldom extended to the level of nation states. And the larger the nation state is, the less open they are to saying, well, what can we learn from this? Cultural diplomacy has historically worked best between roughly similar countries. So the example I give to my students would be, look at the fantastic cultural diplomacy between France and Germany and the way in which those two countries, beginning with cultural diplomacy through improving their traditional diplomacy, sort of converge over the last 50, 60 years. It's much harder to imagine cultural diplomacy between countries that are very, very different. And when I say to people in America or in the UK, you say you want better cultural diplomacy, you say you want mutual learning, well, tell me 3 things you want to learn from Africa. And there's an embarrassed silence, because those places are not open to being transformed by an encounter with Africa. They don't feel they have anything to learn, and they are still locked in a hierarchical approach to global culture. And I think that we have to challenge ourselves about that hierarchy, which is not in our interests it's not in the interest of cultural diplomacy to preserve that into the future. I hope we can use those remarks as a jumping off point. And we can have a discussion about the future that you would like to see in cultural diplomacy, and perhaps I can flesh out some of the stuff that I skipped over, especially around partnerships and some of the unusual partnerships that are emerging in cultural diplomacy. But thank you so much for your attention, and thank you, Mark, for the kind invitation to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we could turn on all of the lights again, it would be great so we can see each other. So thank you very much, Nick, first of all, for your punctuality in the sense you ended exactly on time, so we actually do have time for discussion and questions, which is great. Secondly, really for your precise and insightful comments. I thought really it was very, very helpful to help us differentiate the different kinds of cultural diplomacy, as well as this evolution which is taking place, and in terms of what we might expect for the cultural diplomacies of the future. So really appreciate that. The rest of the time is now yours for questions or comments. I still think it'd be good to keep the 30-second rule just to allow as many voices as possible to be shared, and we might be able to do 2 rounds of questions given the time. So who would like to begin? We'll start maybe in the front row and then we'll move our way back. Please.
Thank you. Yes, Marcos Kounalakis. Thanks, Dr. Cull. I wanted to ask a question about your focus on memes and to look back at the memes that have existed historically as a historian and see and ask you about the cultural long tail of those memes that have existed in the past and what effect they have going forward.
Oh boy.
And maybe we'll take 3 questions and then a response and then another 3. How does that sound? Is that okay? Who is next? Yeah, okay.
Hey, Nick. I'm going to throw the question back to you, which is, what are 3 things that the US and the UK should learn from Africa? And I'm going to preempt you by saying, I already accept the idea that music would be one area. So I'm just curious how you'll address that. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask a question. Some topics that you touch in your presentation are also touched by cultural policy. And therefore, my question is, which is the difference between cultural diplomacy and cultural policy?
All right, so you can have some responses, and then we'll take a second round.
Yeah, hold on just a moment. Right. Okay. First of all, Marcus and the focus on memes. Well, that is a question that one could write a whole book on, because in a way, a language is the ultimate meme. And you can look at democracy as a meme. There are all sorts of, anything can be reduced to a meme. It's as fundamental a unit of understanding our world as a gene and thinking in terms of organisms. So all I would say is that in terms of communication, I think we underestimate memes at our peril. And I would say that the rumor has, in the past, been a very effective meme. And often what one is up against as a communicator are the rumors that you don't know about. And it's interesting how the internet has restored some of the rumor to a prominence that it was losing in the days when authoritative broadcasting, with a few people having access to the mass media, were in charge, and communication was very mediated through a few gatekeepers. Now there are no gatekeepers. You see the sort of the chaos that can come, and you may condemn it, but you can't change it that way. We have to live in a world where all sorts of stories are out there and will continue to be out there about ourselves. And it's a very difficult, very challenging reality to adjust to. Turning to Neil, personally, what I'm interested in Africa is I'm interested in South Africa at the moment and in the process of reconciliation that's going on. It's very interesting to see how South Africa became involved in the peace process in Northern Ireland. And I think that wasn't quite understood, the way in which South Africa was able to take a lead role in peacemaking in Northern Ireland. Obviously, musical culture is an important thing for us to look at. But I think in terms talking to Africans, I'm always interested in the notion of family and the notion of identity and how that differs from what we have in the West, where the way in which people would routinely support an extended family and have a sense of themselves as connected to an extended family is something that we've forgotten. I'm also, in the age of social media, where it suddenly comes as a surprise to people that media is social. In Africa, it never stopped being social. It never stopped being all about memes, all about informal communication. And it's very interesting to see how Africa has been able to leap over the hyper-mediated stage that happened in the US and the UK, and to go straight into cell phones. And so I think I don't see that there's any question that we have an awful lot to learn from Africa. But the cultural duel for Africa at the moment between, say, the West and China is too often being waged at the expense of Africans, and the Africans are very much aware that neither the Chinese nor the Americans are particularly interested in what they have, or too often aren't interested in what they have to say. Elvira, you raised the subject of what's the difference between cultural diplomacy and cultural policy. Well, I see cultural policy as being something that is domestic, but cultural diplomacy is the foreign aspect of that. So there's no reason why a cultural diplomacy couldn't be an outgrowth of a cultural policy. Does that make sense? So I see the two as related. Is that what you were getting at, or is there?
Because cultural policy is divided in external and internal one. So external cultural policy is a cultural diplomacy.
Okay, if you define it like that, then absolutely. But we're not just talking. But I'm arguing that cultural diplomacy is not just something that the nation state does. To go back to the example that I rushed through of the British Council, the British Council worked with a theatre company in London called the Tricycle Theatre. Now, sometimes the Tricycle Theatre exports plays without any help from the British government. And I would argue that in that instance, the Tricycle Theatre has a foreign policy, is acting as a cultural diplomacy actor, as an entity, as an international actor in its own right. It doesn't have the weight of a nation state, it's just a group of actors and producers and writers, but it is effectively having its own foreign policy. Sometimes when that work fits with the objectives of the British Council, they might have a subsidy from the British Council, as they did with the play Afghanistan, the Great Game, a small subsidy to help them take that work to the United States, and it becomes not only Tricycle Theatre cultural diplomacy, but also British government cultural diplomacy, and then over the top of that, other partners will become involved as well. So in the case of the Great Game, the partner for the major show they did of this play at the Pentagon for the Americans who are actually fighting the war in Afghanistan, partnered with an organization that was designed to help wounded soldiers called the Bob Woodruff Foundation. So it was a very unusual alliance between the Pentagon, the British Council, a radical left-wing theatre company, and a foundation for wounded soldiers. Those were not people you would ordinarily see, or who were really used to even talking to each other, but they came together through cultural diplomacy to create a really remarkable cultural moment. And I did a poll of the audience, and 100, it's the only time I've done a poll where I've got 100% finding. Every single person who returned a survey from that audience said, this play, this cultural play, is useful to me in my military career. Everybody thought it was relevant, and that was an amazing piece of cooperation, of partnership in cultural diplomacy. But thanks for the question. That's helpful. Thank you.
We can take a few more questions. Who would like to go next? Or one here?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm Seppo Poutanen from Finland, and I'm in social research, not in diplomacy in any strict sense. I would like you to elaborate a bit on certain tension I think I recognized in your presentation. It's between how you describe certain empirical developments and related to the future, the preferable future. You mentioned about how this explosion of social media has in part led to the state where people want information from the people like themselves. Same kind of people.
Uh-huh.
Isn't there danger of ghettos, innumerable ghettos of information, where information is in many sense only in quotes? If people want only information from people like themselves, it leads to very limited content of information. How this is related to the valuable goals of cultural diplomacy.
Thank you. And then Amanda, if you could come up, there's a question here in the middle. If you just pass it to you.
Hi, I'm Evan Chow from Hong Kong, now studying in UK. You mentioned at some point the emergence of more sub-state actors or cities. That I find it really interesting. Like, how do you observe this trend? Like, is it more cities and sub-state are trying to develop their own kind of somehow foreign policy? And how do you see this trend growing? Like, do they have, what kind of their motives? And do you see conflicts between those sub-state actors or cities with their central governments or their policy? And what's your comment on that? Thank you.
Okay, Professor Cull, if you can maybe respond and
Sure.
also have the concluding remarks.
So propose a question first. Is there a tension? Yes, absolutely there is. But what I'm saying is that you have to recognize the tendency of the internet to allow you just to get information from people like you. And in some circumstances, you need to work with people where they are. But I think obviously also we need to work to open up people to getting information from people not like them. Having said that, where you see these great blocks where people believe themselves to be all the same, I think it's helpful to disrupt that through introducing different and contrasting peer-to-peer networks. Now, that sounds very technical, but what I mean is, when I look at the problem of the US not understanding China, and the problem of China not understanding the US, the problem that could have us all at war in 10, 15 years if things are messed up, the way that you counter that divide is to dramatize the individuality of those two countries one to another. So you connect Chinese academics to American academics who work on the same things, Chinese doctors to American doctors, Chinese comedians to American comedians, Chinese postal workers to American postal workers, Chinese farmers to American farmers, because peers have more in common with each other than they do with the rest of their country. I have lost an uncle this year who was a Danish sea captain. And he had more in common with any other sea captain than any other person. When he got together with a sea captain or a sailor from another country, they were part of a special brotherhood. And their identity, that knowledge, that brotherhood that came from the shared experience of the sea was a much more powerful bond than the national identity. And finding ways to help other people to develop these bonds, to recognize the commonalities that they share, I think is a way of disrupting the tendency. What I'm saying is we can use affinity, so we can use new affinities, establish new affinities to make it more complicated, to break down our tendency to collapse inwards into tiny little closed echo chambers of people exactly like ourselves. And turning now to Edwin's question, I think that this issue of the city in foreign policy is a very exciting one. And Hong Kong is an excellent example of a city which has its own foreign policy. It has its own, certainly it has its own soft power. It has the power to attract people. Part of the reason that cities are succeeding in their cultural diplomacy is because they have great credibility. I think that the larger you are, the harder it is for you to be consistent. So the largest cultural players out there have so many inconsistencies that their images don't really make sense. You can always introduce a contradiction and say, well, that isn't true, that isn't true, that isn't true. A city has a much easier job of presenting itself as a unified whole. I would also say that if you look at opinion polling, the larger a player is, the more intimidating they are to the world. Humans are repelled by strength. The David and Goliath story is pretty well universal around the world. People understand what that story means, and nobody cheers for the big player in that story. Everybody roots for the little guy. And cities somehow fit with human consciousness. it's very hard to even imagine a vast country. But you can imagine a city. So when people tell stories about travelers, they tell the story about the traveler going to a city where they encounter people who are all like one thing or all like another thing. And if you look in science fiction, most science fiction only deals with city-sized cultures, even though that city might exist on a planet. Basically, they go to a city, they meet the king of the city, and there's no difference, there's no distance between the imagination of Homer and the imagination of Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. That Roddenberry wasn't capable of imagining the diversity of a planet-sized culture. He was still working at cities. So cities are the building blocks of human culture. There's something that we're very comfortable with, and I think that there's this great potential there. But absolutely, you asked about the potential for conflict. Yes, there is. And when a city sets itself up to speak for the whole country, other people in the country become very resentful. So in the United Kingdom, for example, people in other places in the UK get very irritated by London speaking for the entire country. And I know you get these tensions in other places. Having said that, it's still, I think if you pass it around and alternate the city that speaks for the whole country, that can do a lot of good because it emphasizes the diversity of your country. And I think when the United States allows New Orleans to speak for it, that says a different thing. Or when it allows Los Angeles to speak, that says a different thing again. So I see great potential in cities. And also, you think if every city has to have a cultural diplomacy advisor, cultural diplomacy capacity, that is jobs for everybody, right? And that's, as young people, that's what you need. So you need more city cultural diplomacy, and then you can work your way up to running the cultural diplomacy of the superpowers. Anyway.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Nick Cull.
Oh,
thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.